My father didn't raise his voice when he said it. That's what made it hurt more. We were sitting across from each other at his kitchen table, the same one I'd done homework at decades earlier. The surface was worn smooth from years of routine. Coffee mugs, newspapers, quiet mornings that never asked for much. I had just told him I was leaving my job. Not retiring, not coasting, leaving. He set his mug down carefully, like he didn't want it to make a sound. Then he said it. No one starts over at 40. He didn't look angry. He didn't look disappointed. He looked certain. And certainty, I learned that day, can be heavier than judgment. I nodded slowly, because arguing would have made it worse. Because part of me still wanted his approval, even then. But inside, something hardened. Because what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was this. They didn't know what I had already done. The truth was, I hadn't started over. I had stalled. For years, I stayed in a role that paid the bills but drained the color from my days. I told myself it was responsibility, stability, maturity. People praised me for it. You're smart to stick it out, they said. At our age, you don't gamble. At our age. As if curiosity had an expiration date. By 40, I had become dependable and invisible. The kind of person companies lean on but never invest in. The kind they thank for institutional knowledge, right before excluding from decisions that matter. I watched younger colleagues rise faster, not because they were better, but because they were newer, cheaper, easier to shape. I didn't resent them. I resented the silence I'd accepted. When I told my father I was leaving, he assumed panic. You don't have a backup, he said. I have a plan, I replied. He shook his head. Plans are for 20-year-olds, he said. At 40, you protect what you've built. I almost laughed, because what I'd built was a cage that looked respectable from the outside. After that conversation, he didn't bring it up again, which was worse. Silence from him meant he'd already decided how this would end. He imagined me crawling back, settling, proving him right. I let him, because convincing him would have required explaining something I wasn't ready to share. And because timing matters. The first months after I left were quiet. Uncomfortably so. No coworkers. No calendar filled by someone else's priorities. Just me, my desk, and the slow realization that I had to decide who I was without a title attached. That part terrified me. But terror, I learned, is often just clarity arriving too fast. People ask polite questions. So, what are you doing now? Consulting? Taking time off? I gave vague answers. Not because I was ashamed. Because I was building something fragile, and fragile things don't survive commentary. My father watched from a distance. I could feel it. Every phone call had a pause before he asked, "How's everything?" I always said, "Fine," which was true, and incomplete. What he didn't know was that the work I was doing now wasn't new. It was condensed. Years of overlooked ideas. Patterns I'd seen, but never been allowed to act on. Solutions I'd tested quietly inside systems that refused to change. I wasn't starting over. I was starting with leverage. But leverage doesn't show itself right away. It looks like emptiness before it looks like momentum. And at 40, emptiness scares people more than failure. One night, about 6 months in, doubt crept in. Not loudly. Softly. What if he's right? What if this is just pride disguised as courage? I sat with that thought longer than I wanted to. Then I opened my notes and remembered why I left. The opportunity didn't come with fireworks. It came with an email. Short, direct. A company I'd advised quietly, informally, wanted to talk. Not about a job. About a partnership. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. This wasn't starting over. This was being recognized for the first time in years. I didn't tell my father. Not yet. Because the most important thing I learned during that season was this. Validation given too early becomes pressure, and I needed freedom more than applause. As I closed my laptop that night, I thought back to his words. No one starts over at 40. And I realized something he hadn't. This wasn't about starting over. It was about refusing to disappear quietly. And that decision, whether anyone believed in it or not, had already changed everything. The hardest part wasn't the work. It was the waiting. Not the passive kind. The kind filled with effort that doesn't echo back yet. The kind where days blur together because there's no external marker telling you you're moving forward. No promotions, no praise, no paycheck that reassures you you're still relevant. Just progress you have to trust. I structured my days carefully, not like an employee, like someone rebuilding gravity. Mornings for deep work, afternoons for outreach and refinement, evenings for reading contracts I didn't yet have a reason to sign. I treated myself like an asset, because at 40, no one else will. Friends were polite. Too polite. You're brave, they said, which is what people say when they're glad it's not them. I could never do that at our age. At our age, the phrase followed me everywhere, like a quiet verdict. My father called once a week, always the same cadence. So, anything new? Still waiting to hear back? Markets are tough right now. I heard the subtext. You could still undo this. I didn't argue. I learned something important. People don't need convincing when outcomes speak. And outcomes take time. The savings dipped. Not dangerously, but noticeably. Enough to sharpen every decision. I passed on things that looked exciting but felt wrong.
I chased nothing impulsively. I had learned the hard way that desperation makes you loud, and loud repels serious opportunity. There were days I questioned myself. Not dramatically. Just small moments of doubt that crept in while doing mundane things. Folding laundry. Waiting in line. Staring at a blank document too long. What if he's right? What if I waited too long? Then I'd remember something critical. The people warning me about age were the same people still negotiating permission. The work I was doing didn't look like progress to anyone else. I was rewriting frameworks, testing pricing models, running numbers based on experience no resume could capture. I wasn't competing with younger professionals. I was replacing inefficiency. And inefficiency doesn't care how old you are, it cares how clearly you see it. One afternoon, my father said something that surprised me. You know, he said slowly, I just don't want you to end up disappointed. I closed my eyes. Disappointed in what? I asked. In thinking you still had time, he replied. That one hurt. Because it wasn't cruel. It was fear, inherited, unexamined, passed down like advice. I chose my response carefully. I'm not chasing time, I said. I'm using it. He didn't reply. Silence lingered. He didn't agree. But he didn't push either. The first real traction came quietly. A conversation that led to another. A recommendation that carried weight. A meeting that ended with, we should explore this. No offer. No guarantee. Just interest. At 40, interest feels dangerous. Because you've learned how often it leads nowhere. But this felt different. Measured. Deliberate. Adult. I didn't celebrate. I noted it. That's something age gives you, restraint. The proposal request came weeks later. Detailed. Specific. Serious. I sat at my desk and read it twice. Not because I didn't understand it. Because I did. And because understanding what someone is really asking for, and what they're willing to pay to avoid, is a skill you don't have at 25. I started drafting terms. Not hope. Not excitement. Terms. What I needed. What I would not compromise. What walking away would look like. That alone told me how far I'd come. My father asked how things were going. Still building, I said. He sighed. You always were stubborn, he said. I smiled. I learned it from you. That made him laugh. For the first time in months. What I didn't realize then was how close I was to crossing a line. Not into success. Into validation. The kind that forces people to rewrite their certainty. And when that happens, especially with parents, the shift is never loud. It's careful. Because it requires admitting something uncomfortable. That starting over isn't about age. It's about courage outlasting fear. The meeting was scheduled for 90 minutes. That told me everything. You don't block that kind of time unless you're serious. Or nervous. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because I needed the room before anyone else filled it with assumptions. The conference table was long. Polished. Impersonal. The kind of table where people usually sat across from me and explained why something couldn't be done. Today, I was on the other side of that conversation. And I felt it in my posture. They came in one by one. No small talk. No wasted energy. That, more than anything, calmed me. This wasn't a courtesy meeting. This was evaluation. The first question surprised me. Why now? One of them asked. Not what do you do? Not what's your background? Why now? I didn't rush my answer. Because the problem matured, I said. And so did I. They exchanged glances. That was a good sign. We talked for over an hour. Not about my resume. About systems that failed quietly. About costs hidden in plain sight. About decisions companies make because they're comfortable. Not because they're smart. I wasn't pitching. I was diagnosing. And diagnosis is what people pay real money for. Halfway through, one of them leaned back and smiled. You've seen this before, he said. Yes, I replied. From the inside. While being told not to touch it. That earned a nod. Not approval. Recognition. I thought about my father then. About the certainty in his voice. No one starts over at 40. If he could see me now, he'd recognize something familiar. Not ambition. Authority. The conversation shifted. From if to how. Timelines. Outcomes. Accountability. That's when I knew. This wasn't a trial. It was a negotiation. They asked what I wanted. Not salary. Not title. Wanted. I took a breath. I want autonomy, I said. I want decision authority. And I want compensation tied to results, not optics. The room went quiet. That kind of ask scares people who aren't serious. But serious people respect it. One of them laughed softly. You're not afraid to walk away, he said. No, I replied. I'm afraid of staying small. That landed. Hard. They didn't make an offer that day. Which was good. Quick offers are cheap offers. They said they'd be in touch. I believed them. And for the first time since I left my old job, I felt something solid beneath my feet. Not hope. Evidence. On the drive home, my phone rang. My father. I almost didn't answer. But I did. How'd it go? He asked. I hesitated. Well, I said. He was quiet. Well, how? He pressed. They listened, I replied. That was enough. That night, doubt tried again. What if this falls apart? What if this is the peak, and you already left safety behind? I sat with those thoughts. Then I did something I'd never done before. I imagined the worst outcome, and realized I'd survive it. That realization changes how you negotiate. 3 days later, the email arrived. Subject line. Next steps. My heart didn't race. It steadied. Because I recognized the tone. Precise. Measured. Intentional. They wanted exclusivity while we finalized terms. Not interest. Commitment. I printed the email. Held the paper in my hands longer than necessary. At 42, you don't chase possibility. You assess it. I called my father that night. I had a meeting, I said. Yes, he replied, careful. They want to move forward, I continued. There was a pause. Then something unexpected. I'm proud of you, he said. Not convinced. Not corrected. But softer. That mattered. What I didn't tell him, what I didn't tell anyone, was how much restraint this moment required. Because this wasn't the finish line. It was the threshold. And thresholds are where people make mistakes. Celebrating too early, trusting too fast, shrinking their asks out of fear. I wouldn't. Not this time. As I closed my notebook that night, I wrote one sentence at the top of the page. Experience compounds. At 42, I wasn't late. I was precise. And the next conversation would prove it. The draft contract arrived on a Monday morning. No flourish. No congratulatory language. Just numbers, clauses, and assumptions. That's how I knew it was real. I didn't open it right away. That surprised even me. At 42, you learn something younger ambition doesn't teach you. Speed is not confidence. I made coffee, sat at my desk, let my hands rest flat on the table. Then I opened the file. The number was there, buried halfway down the page. Not highlighted, not explained, just present. $2 million. Not salary, not a bonus. A contract. Performance-based. Outcome-linked. Clean. I felt it in my chest. Not excitement, but weight. Because money like that doesn't change your life when you sign it. It changes your life when you decide you're worth negotiating for it. The younger version of me would have been grateful. Quick to agree. Eager to please. This version read every line like someone who expected respect. There were things I didn't like. Decision bottlenecks. Reporting structures. A clause that assumed I'd be available in ways I wouldn't. I highlighted them all. Not angrily. Clinically. When we met again, they noticed immediately. You've marked quite a bit, one of them said, half smiling. Yes, I replied. Because I intend to succeed. That reframed the room. They asked me why certain clauses mattered. I didn't answer emotionally. I answered historically. I've seen this fail, I said. I've seen this delay progress. I've watched this create quiet resentment. I wasn't guessing. I was remembering. One of them leaned back. You've done this before, he said. Yes, I replied. Just without the authority. Silence. That sentence carried years in it. They countered. I listened. I countered back. Not aggressively. Precisely. Autonomy isn't demanded. It's justified. At one point, someone asked the question I'd been waiting for. What happens if this doesn't work? He said. I didn't hesitate. Then you'll have clarity faster than you do now, I replied. And I'll walk away having built something measurable. He nodded slowly. That answer wasn't fearless. It was prepared. We broke for a moment. Coffee refilled. Voices lowered. I looked around the room and noticed something subtle. They weren't evaluating my age. They were relying on it. The final sticking point was timing. They wanted acceleration. I wanted durability. We're not building momentum, I said. We're correcting trajectory. That landed. When we shook hands at the end of the meeting, nothing was finalized. But something had shifted. I wasn't asking for permission anymore. I was defining terms. On the drive home, my phone rang. My father again. You sound different, he said after I explained. How? I asked. He replied. Like you already know how this ends. I smiled. I know how I end, I said. That's enough. The final revisions took weeks. Emails. Red lines. Quiet confidence on both sides. No rush. No desperation. They needed me. I respected them. That balance is rare. The day the final contract arrived, I didn't open it immediately either. I went for a walk. Let the air clear my head. Because at 42, you don't confuse victory with noise. You recognize it by peace. When I finally signed, my hand didn't shake. That surprised me most of all. Not because the number was small, but because the journey had already paid me something more valuable. Authority. I called my father that night. It's done, I said. He exhaled slowly. How much? He asked, almost reluctantly. Enough to make the risk reasonable, I replied. He laughed. A real laugh. I guess I was wrong, he said. I paused. No, I replied gently. You were careful. There was silence. Then, I'm glad you didn't listen. So was I. What I didn't realize then was that signing the contract wasn't the climax. It was the quiet proof. The proof that starting over isn't about erasing the past. It's about finally being paid for it. And the world was about to see results. The first week after signing felt strangely ordinary. No announcements. No onboarding ceremony. No congratulatory emails flooding my inbox. Just a calendar invite and a shared folder. That's how I knew this wasn't symbolic. It was operational. They didn't ask me to observe. They asked me to decide. On day 2, I cancelled a meeting that had been recurring for years. Not because it was useless. Because it was performative. The room went quiet. Then someone said, "No one's ever done that." I nodded. "That's why it keeps happening," I replied. At 42, you don't prove competence by speaking more. You prove it by removing friction. I started with questions no one liked answering. Why do we accept this delay? Who benefits from this report? What happens if we don't do this at all? Discomfort followed. Then relief. The resistance wasn't loud. It never is when people are afraid of being exposed. It showed up as hesitation. Let's revisit. Maybe next quarter. We should align. Alignment is what people say when they don't want to choose. I chose anyway. The results didn't come immediately. That was expected. But the signal did. Costs flattened. Decisions sped up. People stopped asking for permission and started asking for clarity. That shift is measurable, even before revenue moves. My father called less often. Not because he didn't care. Because he didn't worry. There's a difference. When he did call, he didn't ask how things were going. He asked what I was building. The first visible win came in week 6. Not flashy. Just undeniable. A stalled initiative moved forward without drama. Someone sent an email that said, "I don't know how you did this, but it's working." I smiled. I knew how. I'd lived it. At 42, you recognize patterns faster because you've paid for them already. With time. With credibility. With opportunities you didn't take because you weren't ready yet. This wasn't luck. It was deferred understanding. People began copying my language. That's when you know influence has landed. They stopped saying, "Try," and started saying, "Decide." They stopped asking who approves, and started asking what matters. Culture doesn't shift with speeches. It shifts with permission. One afternoon, a younger executive asked me something quietly. "How did you get so confident?" I considered the question. "I'm not," I said. "I'm prepared." That answer stayed with him. I saw it in how he spoke afterward. The numbers followed. Not explosively. Correctively. The kind of improvement that doesn't make headlines but makes boards breathe easier. That's what they paid for. Not charisma. Judgment. My father visited a few months in. We sat at the same kitchen table where he'd once told me no one starts over at 40. He looked at me differently now. Not impressed. Reassured. "I didn't know it could look like this," he said. "Neither did I replied. "Until I stopped asking for permission." He nodded slowly. "That was always your problem," he said, smiling. I laughed. The contract didn't change me. It revealed me. It stripped away the last excuse I had for waiting. Waiting for timing. Waiting for certainty. Waiting for someone else to believe first. At 42, you realize belief works best when it's internal. There were hard days. There always are. But none of them felt like regret. Regret has a different texture. This felt like responsibility. And responsibility, when chosen, is grounding. What I didn't realize then was how much this work would echo back to everyone who doubted me. Not with vindication. With quiet recalibration. Because success after 40 doesn't shout. It settles. And as I closed my laptop one evening, long after the office had emptied, I thought about the sentence my father had spoken months earlier. No one starts over at 40. I smiled. Because I hadn't started over. I had finally started from myself. And the results were only beginning to speak. The recognition didn't arrive the way people imagine it does. There was no announcement. No press release. No dramatic moment where everyone suddenly turned and applauded. It arrived sideways. In tone. In posture. In the way rooms changed when I entered them. I noticed it first in meetings. People stopped explaining things to me. They skipped the preamble. They went straight to the problem. That's how you know trust has formed, when no one feels the need to justify why they're asking. Then it showed up in numbers. Not the headline kind. The kind executives don't talk about publicly but obsess over privately. Margins stabilized. Timelines shortened. Risk exposure dropped. The board didn't congratulate me. They stopped worrying. That was better. My father heard about it from someone else. A neighbor. A former colleague. Someone who recognized the company name and did the math before he did. He called me that night. "You didn't tell me it was this," he said. I leaned back in my chair. "You didn't ask," I replied gently. He was quiet. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "I told someone today that my daughter is doing important work." Not impressive. Not successful. Important. That word stayed with me. At 42, praise feels different. It doesn't inflate you. It settles you. Because you've already survived not having it. The company extended the contract. Early. With better terms. That's how organizations say thank you when they don't want to sound emotional. I reviewed it carefully. Signed calmly. And went back to work. My father came to visit again. We sat on the porch this time, not the kitchen. The air was cooler. The conversation slower. "I used to think starting over meant losing everything," he said. I waited. "But watching you," he continued, "I realize it just means refusing to stay where you no longer fit." I nodded. That's all it ever was. He didn't apologize. He didn't need to. Understanding is louder than regret. People began asking my age in conversations. Not out of curiosity. Out of recalibration. Because age had stopped being a liability in their minds. It had become context. A younger colleague said something that surprised me. "I hope I'm brave enough to do what you did." I smiled. "You will be," I said. "When staying becomes harder than moving." That's usually when it happens. The work deepened. The trust widened. I stopped being introduced as new. I was simply there. Integrated. Necessary. That's when you know you've crossed the threshold. One evening, my father said something quietly, almost to himself. "I was wrong about the timing," he admitted. I looked at him. "No," I said. "You were right about the risk." He nodded. "And you took it anyway." "Yes." He smiled. "That's courage," he said. "At any age." The sentence he'd once spoken, "No one starts over at 40, no longer held power. Not because it was disproven, but because it was understood. It was never about age. It was about fear disguised as wisdom. What I didn't realize then was how much this shift would matter to him. Not as a correction. As permission. To see his own life differently. To stop treating time as a door closing and start seeing it as a tool. That night, as I reviewed reports and plans, I felt something rare. Completion. Not of the journey. Of the doubt. Because once you succeed after 40, you stop being afraid of age forever. And I understood something important. This contract wasn't my comeback. It was my confirmation. That experience doesn't expire. That courage compounds. That starting later doesn't mean starting weaker. It means starting with receipts. The number stopped mattering after that. 40. 42. Whatever came next. Once you succeed on your own terms, age becomes background noise, like a clock you no longer check because you trust the time will pass whether you stare at it or not. I didn't frame the contract. I didn't post about it. I didn't tell anyone who didn't need to know. Because by then, I understood something that took me 4 decades to learn. The loudest moments in life are rarely the most important ones. My days settled into a rhythm that felt earned. Decisions instead of meetings. Outcomes instead of updates. Silence instead of anxiety. The kind of work that leaves you tired, but not empty. My father stopped offering advice. That was the biggest change of all. Not because he had nothing to say, because he trusted my judgment. And trust, especially from a parent, is a different kind of validation. One evening, months later, he said something quietly as we watched the sun go down. I thought time was your enemy, he said. But it turns out it was your ally. I smiled. Only once I stopped wasting it, I replied. People still ask me how I did it. What the secret was. What the pivot looked like. They expect a tactic. A hack. A dramatic leap. I disappoint them. Because the truth is quieter. I stopped trying to outrun age. And started using experience. I stopped asking if it was too late. And asked if it was still honest. I stopped protecting comfort. And protected alignment instead. That's what changes everything. Not bravery. Not luck. Alignment. The irony is this. If I'd succeeded earlier, I would have believed it was talent. If I'd failed, I would have blamed timing. But succeeding when everyone expects decline? That teaches you something permanent. That fear lies about expiration dates. I think back to that kitchen table. My father's certainty. His coffee mug placed carefully on the wood. No one starts over at 40. He wasn't trying to limit me. He was trying to protect me from disappointment. What neither of us knew then was that disappointment isn't the worst outcome. Regret is. Signing that contract didn't make me younger. It made me freer. Free from the idea that life only moves forward in your 20s. Free from the pressure to peak early. Free from the myth that experience dulls ambition. If anything, ambition sharpens when it's no longer desperate. When it doesn't need to be seen. When it doesn't rush. I didn't start over at 40. I started correctly at 42. With boundaries. With leverage. With a voice I'd earned the hard way. And that's the part people don't talk about enough. Late success isn't louder. It's steadier. It doesn't beg for attention. It commands respect. Quietly. So if someone ever tells you it's too late, if they say the window has closed, if they warn you that starting again is reckless at your age, listen carefully. Not to the words, but to the fear underneath them. Then decide for yourself. Because sometimes, the most powerful move you can make isn't proving someone wrong. It's refusing to disappear just because the calendar says you should. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.